Martin Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms, or two realms, is one of the most difficult of his doctrines to understand, and probably also one of the most important doctrines to get right if you want to understand Luther's thought. And it's made more difficult by the fact that Luther can mean up to three different things when he distinguishes between two kingdoms, and often it's quite hard to follow. But if you pronounce it in German, it makes it even sound harder to understand. Zweirichlehrer. Anyway, the two kingdoms is another one of Luther's typical antitheses. Luther often uses the contrast to talk about individuals and the relationships in which they stand. The Latin coram means in the presence of, and so Luther will talk about coram Deo, before God, the individual in the presence of God. Coram hominibus, or mundo, coram mundo, means before people, out in human company, or out in the world, in the presence of the public. And we always live, Luther says, in both of these relationships simultaneously. So these two realms overlap and intersect. And Luther uses this distinction to clarify another one of his antitheses, that between faith and works. It's a very biblical antithesis, of course. Things that are required in one realm are not necessarily required or pertinent in the other realm. So before God, coram Deo, what is required is faith. And for Luther, faith in God honors God more than trying to be good and trying to earn his favor, trying to justify yourself, because it means that you trust God more than yourself for your salvation. And so therefore, it really honors God more to have faith in him than to try to earn his approval by being good. So faith also means giving up faith in myself. My first righteous act, according to Luther, is when I confess that I can do nothing myself. And it means that you trust God more than yourself for your salvation. It means that you trust God to be God. And really, he's much better at being God than I am. So in my relationship to God, coram Deo, I realize that God wants my faith, not my good works. And my good works don't really benefit God at all. God doesn't need them. But my faith in him does give him glory. But in my relationship to my neighbor, coram hominibus, well, that's a different story, because my neighbor does need my good works. Here, Luther even quotes the book of James, yes, James, with approval. You know, James says, what good is it if you say to your neighbor, be warm and fed, but you don't do anything about it? It's no good at all. And so you can summarize it like this: trust God and love, actively do good for your neighbor. Trust God, love your neighbor. Now, another distinction that Luther makes here is what he calls active righteousness versus passive righteousness. Now, when it comes to God, the only way to be righteous for Luther is to do nothing. That is, stop relying on your good works and admit that you are spiritually helpless. Your hands are empty, spiritually speaking. That is a passive righteousness that we receive as a gift from God. But with our neighbors, again, it's a different story. God calls us to love them, and that is an active righteousness, one that shows itself in good deeds. Not one that saves us, not one that earns us merit, but still a righteous act. It's justice, it's just. It's the right thing to do. And here, this is interesting, Luther disagrees a bit with Augustine. Augustine says that we should love our neighbor for God's sake. Luther doesn't quite like that. It's like we're using our neighbor to make points with God. There's a kind of mercenary aspect to that in Luther's mind. So Luther says, love your neighbor for your neighbor's sake. It's a free gift to your neighbor when you show them an act of love, just like God's salvation is a free gift from God. Now, Luther's teaching on vocation is another interesting area where Luther's teaching is relatively radical, and this two kingdoms idea comes into play. It plays a major role in Luther's interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount. Luther says that no Christian should ever defend their own rights. You should literally turn the other cheek all the time, because no tyrant can destroy your soul. They can kill the body, they can't kill the soul. And so Luther condemns, for example, the peasants in the German Peasants' Revolt 1524, 1525, for taking up arms against oppressive rulers. Their only recourse, Luther says, is to pray to God to send them a Moses kind of deliverer to rescue them. Otherwise, they just have to endure this injustice and oppression. Now, later in the 16th century, Protestants begin to develop theories of resistance, justified resistance to wicked regimes. And even Luther, later in the century, starts to soften his position. But a major factor in Luther's teaching is this commonly held view in 16th century Europe that it is contrary to nature and to God's design for a person of lesser station, of lower status, to rebel against somebody of a higher station. And that's where the doctrine of vocation comes in, particularly in a 16th century understanding. There is no concept of upward mobility in the 16th century. That idea is totally unheard of. The only people who would ever say such things are dangerous radicals. And nobody listens to dangerous radicals in the 16th century. But according to Luther, everyone has two persons. You have your private person and you have your public person. So as a private person, you can never defend yourself when you're personally attacked. But for example, if somebody attacks your child, part of your vocation, your calling, that's what the word vocation means, your calling as a parent is to protect your child. Then all bets are off. Now in medieval thought, only priests and monks were considered to have a calling, a vocation. But Luther rather radically says that every believer, every Christian has a calling from God. Maybe even non-Christians have a calling from God, but they don't recognize who it is who gives them that call. So even the lowliest laborer has a calling, just as much as a member of the clergy has a calling. And that's very radical and new in Luther's teaching. Now, in addition to the personal, private, internal view of the two kingdoms, there's also an external, visible aspect in which Luther talks about two kinds of government and two realities in the world, which also, like in the personal realm, intersect and overlap. Two ways that God governs the world. And this distinction roughly correlates to the distinction between church and state. In the church, God rules by faith and not by force. It rules by the gospel. Ideally, there is no coercion in the church. There's no force. It is a spiritual government. Luther even has a modest toleration for heretics because nobody can force an individual to believe. Nobody can force faith. But on the other hand, if heretics create a lot of disorder, well, that's another issue. And then it becomes a matter for the state.
We have found a witch. May we burn her?
Who do you know she is a witch?
She looks like one.
Yeah, she looks like one. Bring her forward.
Now, in the state, by contrast, God rules by the law and by the sword. And by the way, Luther is very politically pessimistic. He thinks that there's going to be rather few rulers in heaven. Not very many princes are going to be up there. So whereas the church is a spiritual kingdom, the worldly kingdom is the state. The state is a worldly kingdom intended to take care of a person's material needs, physical needs. And the state uses coercion. So, for example, the police officer doesn't pull you over for speeding and then pray with you. No, he gives you a ticket. Okay, that's two kingdoms in operation there. Now, there's major danger, Luther says, in confusing these two kingdoms. For example, the state is not run by love, it's run by law. Nor can you run the church like it's a secular government. And of course, Luther's critique of the papacy is going to come into play here. And that's what was going on in the medieval period. Bishops were princes, very wealthy rulers, and the Pope was basically an emperor. And the church cannot coerce faith, Luther says. And the church cannot legislate spirituality. So Luther complains that the church in his day has gone very seriously wrong by presuming to legislate piety with fasts during Lent, for example. And Luther traces this back to the papal bull, that is a decree, Unum Sanctum, which Pope Boniface issued in 1302, and it declared that every person must be obedient to the Pope's rule in order to be saved. And the church, Luther thinks, has been corrupted with political power, and it has become sinful and disobedient, no longer representing Christ, but now representing the Antichrist, because it presumes to rule over people with coercion and not guiding people spiritually with the gospel. Now, some further implications of these two kingdoms. First, the way that a state is organized, Luther thinks, is indifferent. It doesn't really matter what form of government you have, a republic or a monarchy. So it's not divinely revealed in Scripture. What you need is natural wisdom to govern a state. Pagans can run a state well, Luther thinks, by natural wisdom. And so states need to be run with equity and with justice. You learn that through natural law. Luther preferred monarchy. Why? Because he was used to it. Zwingli and Calvin, they prefer a republic, somewhat similar to our democracy, but really kind of aristocracy. Why? Because they were used to it. So Luther and Calvin both reject, however, the idea that the state should be implementing Israel's laws from the Old Testament. They reject the idea that Israel's government has to be the model for modern government. And then the requirements for a good ruler is not that the person be a sincere Christian or even a believer, which is an interesting thing to contemplate given American politics and the American relationship between church and state and religion and state. But rather, the important thing for Luther is that they be good at governing. Better a competent heathen than an incompetent believer for Luther. And he rejects the idea that Christians cannot go into that realm of politics, that they can't be politicians or soldiers. Sometimes a Christian could be a very good ruler or a very good soldier. So that's not incompatible for Luther. Nor does Luther have any interest in the idea of a theocracy. Luther does not want to set up a theocracy, and that's really what some of the radical Anabaptists attempt to do in the 16th century. For Luther, that confuses the two kingdoms. God rules the world through both kingdoms, but he rules them in different ways, very different ways. Now, this doctrine of the two kingdoms can be quite helpful and practical, but there are a number of problems that can also arise from Luther's teaching of the two kingdoms. First among them is that you have to ask the question whether it's really true that the Christian exists in both of these realms. Luther says that to the extent that we are Christians, we don't need the law or the coercion of the state. But in fact, we do need to be restrained sometimes. When you become a Christian, you are not automatically fully sanctified. You're not automatically free from every temptation. You're not automatically exempt from addiction or mental breakdown. So everyday life is not always as clear cut as these two spheres sometimes seem to make them. Life is a lot messier than Luther would make it out to be sometimes. Secondly, sometimes Luther's two kingdom language doesn't refer to either one of these meanings, church and state, or the individual before God and their public persona. Sometimes it has a third contrast, particularly when Luther uses the term the world. And sometimes he means the world as the realm of your neighbor, and that's a positive thing. This is where we practice love rather than faith, acts of love as gratitude to God. So how do you behave with your neighbor? You act with love and not rancor. Sorry, this is a rancor from Star Wars, a very cuddly plush one. Anyway, and sometimes the world means the state, the government. The state is necessary for ordering society. And under the best circumstances, the state protects the preaching of the word and protects the ministry of the church. And Luther is clear that if the state undermines or attacks the gospel, well, then Christians can resist the state, and preachers particularly can resist the state through their preaching. So for Luther, Christians often have to be passive in the face of oppression, but not preachers. No, their calling, their vocation is to be prophets of God. According to Luther, it is the preacher's duty to rebuke disobedient rulers, leaders, political figures. That's very interesting. And then sometimes Luther's apocalyptic spirituality leads him to identify the world with the realm of Satan. And when he speaks of the two kingdoms being at war with each other, and sometimes he can use very black and white imagery of combat and good versus evil, light versus dark, and that kind of imagery. And then finally, Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms is rather controversial today, still today, particularly in relation to a couple of very heated issues. First of all, there is the issue of Luther's response to the peasants in the German Peasants' War. It's considerably harsh, though he also rebukes the princes, who by the way, were more dangerous to Luther than the peasants. Luther is not a coward. He's not afraid to rebuke princes who could throw him into prison or worse. So when he speaks in a treatise about the murderous hordes of peasants, however, this is not just him using hyperbole. This is actually what was going on in the wake of the Peasants' War. Murderous bands of peasants were going around committing acts of violence. This was a time of social upheaval and social chaos, social breakdown of the social order. And I think that Luther would have been much more sympathetic to the peasants if they were being deprived of the gospel, according to his theory. But he cares less about their physical needs and their economic needs. And I think there's something troubling about that, something that's very problematic. And yet we find it problematic because we live in the 21st century. It's not problematic in the 16th century. It's basically how people assume the world is. He's a man of the 16th century, and his views about the obedience owed to authorities is absolutely the norm all through the 16th century. The only people who will challenge it are the Anabaptists, and they are considered insane, literally insane, by the rest of Europe. Another issue that is a major one that you'll encounter is the long discussion that's been going on about the relationship or alleged relationship between Luther's theology and the rise of Nazi Germany. And so Luther is accused of separating church and state, these two realms, separating them so much that the German church largely fails to criticize the fascist government when it arises in Germany in the 1930s, because it is a separate realm and it's none of the church's business. But really, this is a serious distortion of Luther's teaching. Though some Nazis, some German Christians, the Deutsche Christen as they were called, tried to promote this view that the church should stay out of politics. Recent books on the subject have pretty well refuted the idea that Luther's two kingdoms is historically related to the rise of Nazi Germany and the hatred of the Jews. Martin Luther, in his later years, does make some rather anti-Semitic remarks, but anti-Semitism is not uncommon in Europe, and it becomes particularly vehement in the 19th century in Germany. So the historical connection between Luther's two kingdoms and the rise of the Third Reich is extremely shaky and highly dubious. One quick vignette. When the Nazis took over Norway, almost every single Norwegian Lutheran pastor resigned their office in protest rather than serve a Nazi regime. And in fact, Luther's theology inspires the Barmen Declaration. If you don't know what the Barmen Declaration is, it's a very important statement of German church resistance to the Nazi regime and the ideology of Hitler and the Deutsche Christen, who tried to take the Bible and make it into an Aryan document, get rid of the Old Testament, make Jesus into an Aryan rather than a Jew. That whole ideology was rejected by the Barmen Declaration, endorsed by theologians like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth. So don't believe the mythology of Luther, the precursor to the Nazis, because he wasn't.